Good morning. Good morning, everyone. I'm just checking with my colleague if technically we're fine. A very warm welcome to you all. And I should say it's still the time of year to say wishing you all a happy new year with strength, determination, and also confidence for Europeans working together on the most pressing challenges that we are facing. I think it is very clear if we're looking at our regional environment just now that it requires stronger European collaboration and determination to keep our citizens safe, to keep our citizens prosperous. But it is also a time that comes with great uncertainty with regard to European cohesion and European unity. And so I don't want to start off the year with too dark ideas, but I think the idea of this gathering is, and I would like to welcome to the EPC our partners in this endeavor. We are jointly hosting this conference on comprehensive security best practices. How can the EU and NATO work better together? I warmly welcome our colleagues from Hanaholmen and the Elisabeth Rehn Bank of Ideas. So thank you very much, Gunvor Kronman, CEO of Hanaholmen, and Robert Eklund, who is the chair of the board of Elisabeth Rehn Bank of Ideas, for the excellent collaboration on this event. For the EPC, this has been very rewarding up to this point, because what you bring to the table is a great deal of experience in both analytical and practical ways. This is very valuable, as ultimately, of course, as a think tank, we are analysts. This event actually is based in the broader context of a project that the EPC launched last May, and that is called DevSec EU. I see a lot of colleagues here this morning as well. We are trying to make a contribution, and we're doing that with partners, and we're absolutely delighted about this collaboration and looking forward to greater opportunity. Now, you are here to learn about what we think on best practices, how to improve NATO-EU collaboration. And I think we can say the challenges are very real and are very clear. We will go into them in the panels that will be, of course, very much on substance, on all levels, on the bigger picture, but also what it means literally on the ground. So I won't spend too much time on mapping out what you as experts, as observers know very well. But I would like to see that we, of course, can conclude that EU-NATO collaboration has gone quite some way over the past decades, which is probably the more fortunate situation at this point in time. And that also includes members, that is Finland and Sweden, now that make a very important contribution to the alliance. But we also are aware that there is a lot of work to do, as the European Commission and EU institutions are setting off with a strong and determined new mandate, a new commissioner designated to work on strengthening an EU-European pillar for security and defense, something we're following closely here at the EPC as well. There is, of course, a lot to do, and that has first and foremost to do with the situation in Europe that Russia provoked in an unprovoked manner. It's war of aggression, it's threats that go well beyond Ukraine right now that we need to take very seriously. And then there is also a global environment that is not playing out in favor for the European Union and its members. And I say very clearly also for those European countries that are committed to working together towards free, prosperous and democratic region. And that, of course, will include countries such as the United Kingdom, Norway, but also the countries that are aspiring to become members of the European Union. There is a global environment that is becoming more challenging, and there's a great deal of uncertainty also with the return of the US president into the White House, that is Donald Trump, over where he sees contributions of the United States to European security. We could have a big discussion about what each and every one of us felt about that, but I think one message is very clear and has been understood, and that is Europeans need to invest a lot more into their security and the resilience and preparedness of our countries and societies, which is what we want to look at today. And being prepared is, I believe, something that is the most natural thing for each and every one of us. Whatever we are facing, we try to be prepared. It's not always easy to be prepared, but my sense is in this area we're talking about, there is a lot we can learn, and we're very happy to have partners that joined today to help us learn and hopefully spread the news. I just want to say a couple of things before we start the conference. And that goes, of course, to our partners. I did say that, but also our speakers who will be joining us both from the cabinet of Vice President of the Commission, Virkkunen, and also from NATO in Benedetta Berti, the head of policy planning at the office of the Secretary General of NATO. And we will be joined by the ambassador of Ukraine to NATO. We're absolutely delighted about that. And we are also very happy to have our colleagues flying in from Estonia, Sweden, coming in, flying in from Sweden, Estonia, and also from Finland, Janne, Känkänen, Krista Brown, and Maria Alajõe. So that is fantastic. And for a political perspective, a parliamentary perspective, to welcome MEP Nicolás Pascual de la Parte. So that for us is very important as we aim with these kind of seminars, as you know, to make meaningful contributions to those who have to decide in a challenging environment and push with policies that have to be determined. We're in the good hands for this day. In Henry Foy, who is here from the Financial Times, taking the lead on chairing the sessions. We're really grateful for that. And talking about the sort of the framing and the relevance, we have a very important opportunity, and I'm sure Gunvor, Kronman, and also Robert Eklund will mention that. I see colleagues coming in, including Nicolás Helbig, welcome, to take a look at a very important policy brief / report that you will find here. I won't say more because I know there will be something said about this, and a commentary by our own Maria Martisiute, who put forward an idea how preparedness can really be something that we need to look at from bottom up as the right of every citizen in the Union. So these reports, please take them, please read them carefully. This is a very good sort of peg to our debate today. So without further ado, I would like to invite Gunvor Kronman here to give her introductory remarks. Thank you again, and let's be ambitious and determined for the year ahead. Thanks.
Good morning, everybody, distinguished speakers and their audience, both here and online. My name is Gunvor Kronman, and I'm the CEO of Hanaholmen Cooperation Center for Sweden and Finland. Hanaholmen is a unique bilateral public-private institution that works to deepen the relationship and the cooperation between Finland and Sweden, and sometimes also with the wider Nordic or European region in all societal fields, and cooperating with governments, private sector, and civil institutions. Our broad mandate reflects the long and the deep bond between our countries. Today, as two still fairly new NATO members, a new dimension has been added to the cooperation, the one of comprehensive security. This year, we also celebrate 50 years since our governments founded Hanaholmen. I really want to thank the European Policy Center and also the Elisabeth Rehn Bank of Ideas for the excellent cooperation that we have had in preparing this seminar. Civil defense, comprehensive security, preparedness, and societal resilience has been part of Hanaholmen's agenda, especially since the start of the COVID pandemic. Before that, we were a long time involved in participating in the deepening of the bilateral military cooperation between Finland and Sweden. In short, what happened was when the pandemic started, between what often was called the best neighbors in the world, was that bilateral cooperation suddenly did not work. Finland and Sweden had different national strategies to deal with the pandemic. National decisions were taken without pre-analysis or negotiation about how the neighboring country was affected by these decisions. especially for the communities who had for hundreds of years lived in a borderless reality. The consequences were dramatic when borders were completely closed. I think this is the reality for many European neighbors as well. We still today live with these scars from the events in the border region. This is when in 2020, we started the Hanaholmen initiative. We created an executive bilateral educational program to ensure that key factors in both countries are familiarized with the basic knowledge about how civil defense and comprehensive security is organized and how decisions are taken in crisis. We have from the very start included equal representation from the public, from the private, and from the civil sectors. This is very important. A key element is that we identify key individuals in both countries that have as similar mandate as possible in critical functions, so that we in this way can build a trust and a knowledge between these individuals. This is also aiming at breaking down silos, which is a huge challenge in addressing societal resilience. Through the scenario-based training that is given during the course, we are identifying gaps, we are learning, we are creating new policies and making suggestions on how to deal with crises better in the future. This program is carried out and executed in close cooperation with the Finnish Security Committee and the National Emergency Supply Agency, thank you, Janne, the Finnish and the Swedish Defense Universities, and the Civil Contingency Agency, MSB, in Sweden. We are now in the course of preparing the 5th bilateral program, and we have many examples already on how cross-border preparedness work has been developed, inspired by the Hanaholmen initiative. One of the program participants, Fredrik Steini, an analyst at the Swedish Civil Contingency Agency, MSB, has lately been involved in developing a new national standard in Sweden for the preparedness of business. The standard is expected to be ready for implementation this year. And according to Steini, the whole idea to develop the standard was born in close discussion with colleagues during the Hanaholmen initiative. Another participant, the Director of Innovation and Business Development at Saab, Johan Belfrage, says that the course itself contributes to building national resilience, since it brings key actors from Finland and Sweden together. According to Belfrage, the principle of matching public and private actors from two countries is unique and extremely important also in other areas of society. What we have learned from the Hanaholmen initiative is that to cope with new, complex, and unpredictable security environment, we must develop our ability to do what we have not done before. And to develop this ability, we need to test, to pilot, to train, and to confront ourselves with a myriad of scenarios and systems. We need to develop our ability to innovate, reconsider old ways of working, and develop, first of all, an all of society culture and resilience. And as late President Sauli Niinistö from Finland in his report to the EU also said that resilience is an attitude. Now I have wanted to highlight the Hanaholmen initiative to make the point that we today discuss comprehensive security, societal resilience, and civil defense. One must not forget to address also cross-border perspectives, as well as the European dimension to our preparedness agenda. Civil defense and preparedness are national responsibilities, as we know, but in a borderless reality like Europe, one must consider streamlining and adapting to neighboring countries' preparedness actions. This is important, both with regards to avoiding additionally harming citizens and communities, as well as to allow for developing joint strategies where preparedness can be optimized by complementary actions. This is no easy task, since both the definition of what is included in civil defense is not streamlined between the countries, nor is the way it's organized nationally. But we don't have any other choice than starting to address these issues and working together for a safer and more prepared Europe. Thank you.
Well, good morning, ladies and gentlemen. Dear ladies and gentlemen, my name is Robert Eklund, and I'm the chair of the board of Elisabeth Rehn Bank of Ideas, and the last organizers to stand between you and the keynote speech and the panel. So bear with me, just I'll try to be brief. But Elisabeth Rehn Bank of Ideas, it's a small independent think tank named after the world's first long-time female Minister of Defense, Elisabeth Rehn. She served in the position from 1990 to 1995. And her legacy is the foundation it's our raison d'etre. But that time it was important with the fall of the Soviet Union in 1991 and Finland joining the EU in 1995. That's 30 years ago today. Elisabeth Rehn herself turns 90 this year, and Bank of Ideas turns 10 years. So her name is quite connected to us, and I'm just going to say that along with being a former MEP, actually, MP and her tenure as Minister of Defense, she's internationally recognized and remembered as a top UN official in the Balkans in the late 90s, first as a UN Special Rapporteur on Human Rights, and then as Undersecretary General and Coordinator for the UN mission in Bosnia and Herzegovina. Those were positions where she observed firsthand the aftermath of brutal atrocities of war on European soil. So those horrible images of war in Europe might be a distant memory for some, but a close reality for too many people in Ukraine today. Nevertheless, they remind us of the importance of today's topic, which is preparedness and comprehensive security, building capacity to be ready, to be prepared if disruptive means occur, and learn from ways of keeping society secure. Ultimately preventing war by strengthening, for instance, psychological resilience, physical safety, and institutional cooperation. And Estonia, Finland, and Sweden provide examples of this. And in our policy paper, which you can pick up a copy from there, also find it on our website, you can read a snapshot of the security culture mindset of these countries on this topic of preparedness, which is very integrated into the foundation of how our societies operate. And how that could be considered in an EU-NATO context. So lastly, I would like to thank the Ministry of Foreign Affairs of Finland for financially supporting our independent project, and also thank European Policy Center and Hanaholmen for co-organizing this event, and as well all of you for showing interest and attending. And now I have the honor of welcoming our first keynote speaker to the podium. Marlene Rosemarie Madsen is the Deputy Head of Cabinet for the EU Commission's Executive Vice President, Virkkunen, who is a Commissioner for Tech Sovereignty, Security and Democracy since December 2024, when the new von der Leyen Second Commission began its work. An economist by training from the University of Copenhagen, she has worked well over a decade for the EU Commission, previously in roles as Deputy Head of Cabinet for Commissioners Katainen in the Juncker Commission, and Ferreira in the first von der Leyen Commission, as well as Deputy Director for Ukraine Service and Head of Unit of Economic and Sectoral Policies. Before the EU Commission, she's worked with economic issues, for instance, for the Danish Ministry of Foreign Affairs, Chamber of Commerce, and UK Department of Trade and Industry. So will you please join me in welcoming her to the podium, and thank you on our behalf.
Good morning, everyone. I hope you can hear me loudly. First of all, many apologies for the Executive Vice President, Virkkunen, could not attend today. I hope you have heard of the sudden decision to arrange a NATO Alliance Summit in Helsinki today. exactly to address many of the issues of cooperation between the EU and NATO when it comes to addressing threats to our critical infrastructure and other threats. So the cooperation exactly that you have arranged this very, very timely event to address, unfortunately meant that she could not participate herself. So you will have to make do with me instead, but she would very much have wanted to be here. It is a key part of her agenda for the next 5 years, and something that we will work with huge dedication to address and come forward with proposals. We have had a busy start already, actually, with issues exactly related to the topic of today, of addressing whether it is that humans are made into weaponized on our borders, or whether it is the security against cyber threats of our hospital infrastructure, etc. These are the topics that have already been running fast these last 6 weeks that we've had of this mandate. But it is an honor for me to be here today, and thank you very much for the invitation, and not least for organizing this very important event and get these very distinguished speakers for the program today. We have seen that the comprehensive security is indeed, as I already mentioned, a topic that is on everyone's mind these days, more than ever. It's not a new concept. We have been working for many years on the idea of comprehensive security as a concept and as a goal of what it was that we wanted to address our efforts towards. However, the last years, whether it was almost 3 years ago with the attack on Ukraine, or whether it's the recent attack that we have seen over the last years, or whether it is the recent event on critical infrastructure in the Baltic Seas, it is becoming more and more important. Europe faces many kinds of challenges in this context, and it is a crucial time for looking at the agenda of the policies for the next 5 years and see how can we further strengthen, how can we further cooperate among the member states, and certainly also how can we improve cooperation with vital third countries and with NATO in this aspect. So EU's strength in preventing and addressing conflicts and crises lies in the vast toolbox that we do possess, and the ability to use the means necessary at hand in cooperation with not least also NATO. So ladies and gentlemen, here in these opening remarks, I want to touch briefly, I've been given 10 minutes. I will try to be very brief on some of the issues that the European Union will try to enhance through our comprehensive security. I will also touch upon some of the topics that President von der Leyen, and more specifically also under her political guidance, Executive Vice President Henna Virkkunen is planning to introduce these next 5 years. So as mentioned already, the last few years have been a sharp reminder of how we should never take peace for granted. The years have also shown that Europe has to give itself the means to defend and protect itself and to deter potential adversaries. Security is fundamental for people's safety, of course, that is obvious, but it certainly is also for them and thereby also Europe to thrive. So it is going way beyond security as a more traditional manner, but also touches upon all of our activities and our livelihood in Europe. We are facing complex security threats. These range from the war on our borders in Ukraine and the need for Europe to do more to defend itself against hybrid and cyber threats. It's attack on our critical infrastructure. It's foreign information manipulation and interference. And it is, as I mentioned, the weaponization of people and all types of policies. Europe's security also depends on having strong external borders. And we will be working dedicated on both building on the internal security strategy that will set out the comprehensive response on the various security threats that we can tackle from within, and that will come forward this year. We will also be providing guidance to the work to strengthening operational capabilities for border management and respond to threats at the EU's external borders, working closely with member states. The Commission will also continue working on a fair and firm approach to migration, implementing the Pact on Asylum and Migration, working with member states and EU agencies to turn legal commitments into action and completing the work where necessary. The European Commission will also work on strengthening all the work on the resilience and the functioning of our democracy, notably through the new European Democracy Shield, which is a key priority of the first year of this Commission. The European Democracy Shield will have many different elements in its package that are addressing issues that can attack our democracy. We have already had a taste of having to, for instance, see a country decide to redo an election lately because of concerns of what could have happened of interferences. This is, as I said, crucial also when it comes to the rapid, the reports and the rapid responses that we can give in this aspect. We have also witnessed several incidents affecting cables in Europe. Whether accidental or intentional, they demonstrated the vulnerability of our critical infrastructure against a backdrop of geopolitical tension and hybrid campaign against the EU. Such incidents are expected to continue and possibly intensify. We need to step up collective EU efforts, also in cooperation with other organizations such as NATO. We need a common response to prevention, detection, responding, recovering, and deterring threats to critical infrastructure. This we will come forward with in our package very soon, responses to this. The awareness that we needed to be able to come forward with efforts on the preparedness is also something that was already mentioned by von der Leyen last year. Europe needs new ambitions on the crisis and security preparedness. To that end, EU had already last year asked the former Finnish president of the Republic, Mr. Sauli Niinisto, to produce a report on EU civil and military preparedness. The Commission will carefully consider the recommendations presented in this report and work towards establishing the Preparedness Union strategy as a cornerstone of EU's resilient building efforts. The Niinisto report underlines the need for ambitious new approach to EU's preparedness and readiness. It presents around 80 recommendations for both short-term and medium to long-term actions. True preparedness will require a more comprehensive and integrated approach. All relevant military and civilian crisis response actors need to be fully ready and capable to respond effectively and seamlessly as part of a wider whole of government and whole of society approach. A higher level of preparedness is needed across the board, linking internal and external security and drawing on both civilian and all military means. Importantly, the Niinisto report also highlights that a strong EU-NATO partnership is essential in this context. No one can do this alone. We have to increase the cooperation, as mentioned in the beginning of my intervention, both within the EU, among member states, even if this means in areas where we have so far had little interaction at EU level, but also with key third countries and with NATO. Already the COVID crisis showed us that when new threats arise, EU member states stand ready and the European Commission stand ready to look at great speed how new cooperation can be developed how information can be pooled, and how preparedness and reactions can be put in place as toolboxes that can be used whenever needed. We can do the same in this area, and we will do it. Our two organizations already address common challenges, drawing on their respective toolboxes in line with their respective mandates, while recognizing the different tasks and mandates of each organization, as well as their autonomy of decision-making and respective competences. The Niinisto report also identifies the need to map out within the EU what the implications of major military contingencies would be, in coherence and complementarity with NATO. Moreover, the Niinisto report states that the EU and NATO should consider ways to reinforce effective coordination and to exchange the exchange of information between staff when it matters the most. So to end this brief keynote intervention, I think the way von der Leyen has put the security at the core of her program for the next 5 years, as she has decided to appoint an executive vice president to exactly be responsible for the portfolios that are all linked to comprehensive security actions and matters, are testimony to how important this agenda will be for the EU for the next 5 years. Along with our initiative on security, defense will also be high on the agenda. We have now established a new position, a first ever Commissioner for Defense and Space. On defense, EU's work in the next 5 years will be focused on building a true European defense union. To frame the new approach and to identify Europe's investment needs, EU will jointly present a white paper on the future of the European defense in the first 100 days of this mandate. Central to the work on defense will be the strengthening of the EU-NATO partnership. EU will continue to extend cooperation with NATO to cover all threats, including new dangers linked to cyber, hybrid, or space, and to strengthen our transatlantic partnership. So, ladies and gentlemen, the title of this seminar, How Can the EU and NATO Work Better, is an excellent one. It could not be more spot on for what is the challenges that we need to address these even in the short term. For the European Union, NATO is an essential partner. We have already been close partners. We have seen over the last years more member states wanting to join NATO, and NATO will continue to be an essential partner for the EU. We have already been working together. We will continue to do so, and we will do it in an even more close and effective and efficient manner. So today's conference in Finland that I started mentioning why the Executive Vice President could not be here is exactly on these matters. And I know you have a tight program for today, but just to mention that I could expect also maybe some statements made there, and would urge you to also pay attention to the press conference that will happen in an hour and a half, so to speak. I don't know if that fits with a coffee break somewhere. But that, ladies and gentlemen, that was just the brief words. I wanted to hopefully help a bit on what it is that we're going to prioritize in the short term, and I wish you a very good event today. Thank you very much.
Good morning, everyone. Good morning. There we go. My name is Henry Foy. I'm the Brussels Bureau Chief of the FT. Welcome, everyone, to the stage. Thank you to the EPC for hosting us and to the other organizers for this morning. And thank you to Marlene for the keynote speech. We're going to talk about comprehensive security best practices and mainly how EU and NATO can strengthen preparedness in Europe. It's always a pleasure as a moderator when you're the least informed person on stage. about the topic, which means I should be able to speak for as little as possible. But I'll introduce the panel now. Krista Brown is the head of international affairs at the Civil Contingencies Agency of Sweden. Nicolás Pascual de la Parte is not here, but will join us, we're told. He is the coordinator of the Security and Defence Committee in the European Parliament for the European People's Party. Ambassador Nataliia Galibarenko is the ambassador of Ukraine to NATO. Thank you so much for joining us. Janne Känkänen is the CEO of the National Emergency Supply Agency of Finland. And last but by no means least, Maria Alajõe is the Deputy Secretary of the Estonian Ministry of Economic Affairs, and most importantly, the Chair, Supervisory Board of the Estonian Stockpiling Agency. So we have, you can see the theme here. These are people whose job really revolves around preparedness completely. Jan, I want to start with you. Finland has this reputation for being the most prepared country in Europe. Is that true? And and if so, how did you do it?
Thank you very much. I think is this working? I think it is. Well, this is one of those good questions. I should say that yes, Finland is well prepared, has been well prepared. I would call the Finnish approach a sort of a legacy system to a large extent, but it's a positive legacy system and very positive in the sense that the world today very clearly demonstrates the need for enhanced, well-developed preparedness. So we never sort of abandoned those systems that existed during the Cold War. Of course, this dates back to decades now, but it's kind of the foundation for what we do still, of course, in an updated way. The same goes for the National Conscription Service, the military side, and in the similar way, we have sort of developed, sort of sustained and developed the, let's say, the civil defense, preparedness, resilience. By the way, this is really a jungle of terminology when we talk about preparedness, resilience, security of supply, all things. I think one idea probably at the European level would be to kind of agree on the terminology and to try to start it from a kind of a common approach, and that I think requires kind of common language to the necessary extent. That's a little bit of a side remark.
Finnish is famously one of those languages that many people speak. What words would you use?
I'm trying to speak English. Yeah, but to answer your question, I think we are probably well prepared as a whole, as a society, to different contingencies. But nothing is perfect, as we know. I mean, these are systems that need to be continuously updated, developed. They need to be evolved over time because of the fact that the world changes, the environment changes, and now we see a profound change. It's really a huge wave of change in different dimensions. It's first and foremost the geopolitics, and we see, of course, the Russian aggression is the first threat in a way, also in the medium term, I would say, against Finland as well, against many other countries in Europe in a similar way, but also in terms of technology, in terms of climate. All these things call for a kind of a comprehensive approach and an enhanced approach to preparedness. And we are prepared, but we are sort of developing that all the time. And we would be extremely, and have been extremely, interested in pursuing this together with other countries, because I think that it's the international cooperation and interaction and all the kind of solutions that we can work out together. They actually are key to real preparedness in the modern kind of time, if you like, especially if you think about these big challenges, Asia, in a way the China risk, let's say, the uncertainties in the transatlantic relationship, if that's the right way to describe it, and so forth. But yes, we are well prepared. We want to cooperate, and we obviously need to do more all the time. I'm not going to say if we are number one or number two in the European sort of arena, but yes, we have the kind of systems in place, operating models, cooperation structures, technical systems. But I should be quite honest in saying that, yes, we need to do more in order to be able to truly address the possibility of an armed conflict, right? And I was able to visit Ukraine a few months ago, and I should also say that there we could see kind of resilience in action. That's true resilience. So everything we do, even in Finland, is a little bit on paper. That's why I also would like to mention exercises and the way that we need to. One of the key kind of components in preparedness is kind of exercising together, sort of trying to see these things in practice. But sorry, I'm a bit on the lengthy side.
No, I'm very keen to come back to this idea of the right language. Ambassador, though, I mean, Janne just mentioned it there. I mean, obviously, for tragic reasons, Ukraine's preparedness has been thoroughly tested in the last 3 years. I guess I'd say, how much have other EU and NATO countries turned to you? And do you think they're learning fast enough from your experience? And how can your experience help them learn faster?
Thank you. Good morning to everybody. And maybe I will start a bit of terminology, as my colleague mentioned, because we in NATO, we just really love the term resilience. Like resilience is everywhere. So everything that you are doing good is called resilience. So that's why, and I also agree that maybe Ukraine is the best example so far of being resilient. And this is, I think, also the response when we was frequently asked, like, why it happens so that Ukraine already withstands for 3 years, while it was predicted that it will only stand like for 10 days. And I think that the right response is actually resilience on different levels. And for me, some things were also coming as a surprise. For example, when in the first months of the Russian aggression, the local administrations were actually capable not to live in chaos, but to organize people, even in terms of any attacks made by Shaheds or missiles. So there was a very quick response in terms of restoring infrastructure, of helping people. So the emergency services were doing their best. Sometimes, like, the Russians were calling us like we are like ants. For example, they are bombarding us and we are like ants, like, gathering together and making a restoration in a very fast way. So this is something I think is key for our European and NATO colleagues. When you are facing the aggression like we do in Ukraine, when it is not about only, conventional things, but this is also about hybrid things, cyber attacks, very hostile propaganda, disruptive technologies and disruptive group of people operating inside the country, trying also to disrupt the country from inside. So I think the best response can also be only the complex one. I think maybe I will mostly recommend to my, especially like NATO colleagues, to look more attentively at the issues of defense spending and defense production. And this, I think, was also key in terms of any preparedness that we are talking about. So this lies in the core, so to say. For example, in the terms of defense production, I think it's also the lesson learned that we were not able, to deliver what was promised, for example. So the defense production was expected at some level, but then unfortunately, when we realized, and we have seen the figure, I think made public by Minister of Defense of Germany, Mr. Pistorius, that Russia produces in 3 months like all the amount of missiles and weapons that the NATO countries are producing in 1 year. I'm afraid this is a very bad verdict for all of us. because we also in Ukraine are trying now to speed up and produce certain things of weapon and certain types of equipment, at least also with the foreign investment to help the battlefield, and also to maybe also to fill the gaps when, for example, the stocks of our European partners are unfortunately empty. So, and this why I think, like, you know, also the Secretary General was very frank recently, and I like it when he said it's only one option. We should speed up the defense production and the production of weapons, or otherwise we will be learning Russian. So this is something that should be also like a bitter lesson for all of us. Like a lot has been done, and while Ukraine actually stands is also because and in favor of international help, and we are very thankful for that. But this is something I would also like to draw your attention to. While we are looking at different ways of countering like Russians, different disruptive technologies that they can use against their NATO allies, but this is something that we should look at.
Thank you so much. Krista, I'm going to put you on the spot here a little bit with the panel title. Sweden, of course, like Finland, just recently joined NATO. As a country that was sort of doing preparedness itself in an EU framework, now in a NATO one, how is the coordination? Do they give you the same advice? Are they talking the same language?
First of all, kind of getting back to the previous points that have been mentioned, I mean, not to be too dark, but I mean, the security situation is evolving fairly rapidly, and that's prompted a lot of work in Sweden, and also a bit of a rethink in terms of how we approach security. In Sweden now, we're looking at this from a, quote, total defense standpoint, which involves a lot of strategic and structural change in Sweden that's ongoing right now in terms of how we collaborate between sectors. We now have a minister for civil defense. We have a new national security council, et cetera. But it also means we're investing in a lot of very specific types of work that enhance our resilience. And a lot of that is based on the hard-fought lessons that we're seeing coming out of Ukraine that are being shared by our Ukrainian colleagues. This involves population protection. This involves the willingness to defend, increasing public morale. Conscription is coming back on the civilian side. But we're also doing a lot of work on security of supply and critical infrastructure protection. And that's being done in close collaboration with obviously our Finnish colleagues, but also increasingly with our Estonian colleagues at ESPA and other stakeholders there. So that's really good to see that that's happening. In terms of the EU-NATO collaboration, I mean, we've been involved in the EU for quite some time now, obviously, and the newest member in the NATO alliance. And I think it's important before we get to, you know, the collaboration that exists between EU and NATO, it's important to look at what do we have on either side and be very specific about it. And then we can talk about the interplay between them. And, you know, I mean, in speaking to my colleagues in preparation for this panel, we pointed to some very important initiatives. And we started discussing, you know, how does it look like in terms of the collaboration? And just to give you some color, for instance, the Union Civil Protection Mechanism on the EU side. It's important in terms of building capacities within the Union to deal with disruptions, including ones related to security incidents. It's also a key tool in providing support to Ukraine right now. Within the context of that, they're looking at CBRN, they're looking at population protection, mass evacuation, et cetera. Then we have exercises. On the EU side, recently, there was something called the PACE exercise, the Parallel and Coordinated Exercise, which involved a NATO Article 4 activation, and there was NATO consultation involved there. Importantly, there's a lot of EU legislation. For instance, the Critical Entities Resilience Directive, which is coming online now, as is the NIS2 directive. These are just two examples of EU legislation that helps boost NATO resilience as well. And then finally, we have the policy dimension. And obviously here we have the preparedness strategy that's already been mentioned. There's also the notion of developing a civil defense mechanism on the EU side. And the EU is also facilitating hands-on practical exchange of experts. As we speak, right now, there's a 5-person Swedish delegation headed to Finland and then Estonia using EU funds to discuss security of supply and critical infrastructure protection. And then on the NATO side, we have obviously the various committees. One that we follow particularly closely is the Resilience Committee, which consists of different planning groups, one on civil protection, for instance. They're looking at population displacement. They're looking at mass evacuation. They're looking at civilian planning, public-private collaboration, climate change. And then also on the NATO side, importantly, they're ramping up work on drawing lessons from Ukraine. And something that Sweden is invested in and is a political champion of is the Joint Analysis Training and Education Center, JTEC. So that's what's going on the EU side and the NATO side. But what about the collaboration? Well, first of all, we know, and this is something that was alluded to by the deputy cabinet member, we know that there's strategic level coordination and agreement between the EU and NATO, something that's been around for quite some time now. We know that there's regular staff-to-staff exchanges on different policy areas, including critical infrastructure protection. We know that there's a lot of operational collaboration ongoing. One example that's been in place for a while is between the Emergency Response Coordination Center and the Euro-Atlantic Disaster Coordination Center on the NATO side. Also, Nord Stream and the war in Ukraine. These are examples of incidents that have really pushed the EU and NATO together. And one very concrete example of that is the EU-NATO task force on critical infrastructure protection. There's work ongoing staff to staff in that track. There's also work ongoing to coordinate in supporting Ukraine. Another very important element of the policy interplay between the EU and NATO is on obviously the baseline requirements on the NATO side and the new disaster resilience goals on the EU side. And we saw in the negotiations of the resilience goals that they were very much looking at the NATO baseline requirements and making sure that they were aligned, which is really important for countries that find themselves in both constellations. Last point, how can it be better? Obviously, there's always room for more complementarity. One very good example that we see today is on military mobility, where we see that NATO initiatives and EU investments are very much complementing one another in this area. We're very much looking forward to more details, and maybe this is something we'll get at the press conference in a couple hours, but on this high-level task force on EU-NATO collaboration that was announced in October of 2024. And then also getting back to the Niinistö report, I mean, there's a lot of very interesting recommendations in that report, and one that perhaps deserves some particular attention, I think this was also mentioned earlier, was on the emergency protocol between the EU-NATO when things get hot. Because we talk a lot about EU-NATO collaboration in the context of policy development over the longer term, but also what does it mean in a particularly serious situation? And then finally, and this is where allies and member states come into the picture, this is a team effort, ensuring that this EU-NATO collaboration happens. And in many instances, member states, allies, have a better idea about what's going on in the different tracks than colleagues in the EU and NATO. We have a very important role to play in bringing visibility to where there are potential overlaps, where the potential complementarities, et cetera. So it's very much a team effort is my final message. Thank you very much. Thank you so much.
Maria, the downside of being the last person to be turned to is that after three people saying everything's wonderful, I'm going to ask you what's not wonderful, especially given that I imagine the stockpiling agency, you know, your job is to constantly be thinking, what don't we have enough of? Where is preparedness not strong enough?
That's a good question. That's definitely a good question. If you hear the colleagues saying what we should be ready to, it's really difficult, because I mean we have to start already saying what is this preparedness? What should we be ready to? And the different scenarios. Yes, we are more and more talking about complex scenarios, about military scenarios, more and more. And if you listen to that, it's I think I can cite Niinistö report that none of us is ready, actually. And that's clearly there when you read. Yes, I have also to say that my background is definitely not in security. I also have worked on industry and business contingency issues, and also in Brussels, like an attaché reporting for transport, industry and space. So I much more look at those topics. But now in the stockpiling agency, it all comes together in a way, because we understand that we have to be ready for complex crises. And it's not like only stockpiling, but what has been said already, that it's so many levels. I mean, public readiness, private companies, how are they ready? And how are civil persons, how are citizens ready? So it's not about one agency or something like that. It's so much broader, the topic what we're talking. So yeah, we would like to have the legacy of Finland and the knowledge of Swedes, but we try to take it, and are certainly learning so much from Ukraine at the moment. I think it's one of the, so sad to say, but this is something we have to learn. And defense was mentioned. We're also putting a lot of money at the moment to build up a defense fund to support Estonian companies and others to come and build the defense industry there. Yes, but going back to stockpiling, yes, if you mentioned that stockpiling, yes, we do certainly fuel stocks, we do food, we do medical equipment, medical devices, medicine, generators, because one of the big things what we have to do and what we have learned is generators to keep the system functioning, connection issues. There are many things, but what we also have learned, that I would say most of the European countries are actually small and open economy countries. Yes, there are some who are big, but most of us are small, and we are oriented to the fact that the trade is functioning, that supply systems or supply chains are functioning. And there is a big issue, how can we operate where the supply is not coming in? If we have to stay, like, I hope not never 3 years, but for a longer time than a month or 2 months, because then the stock reserves of bigger companies, wholesale companies, will not last for that. We can help them with generators, we can do those things, but the how to keep the system functioning, I mean, bad and good examples is COVID. If everybody closes the borders, what will happen? And I hope that we've learned from that. And what else I would say, I think Europe is doing in a now much more well, in the sense that, for example, in the area of semiconductors, we introduced the monitoring system. I think in many areas we should actually look at the supply in the sense whether it is there, how it's functioning, what is critical for us. This certainly is there. So there are many things, but if we think about one country, especially about the frontline countries, it's clear that none of us can function on our own resources. Not the question about whether we have enough of them, but most probably it's more about that there has to be some prepositioned resources in neighboring countries, whether we're talking really about food or whether we're talking about blood, for example. So it's not easy to think what we should be prepared, but we do deal with it every day, working with different scenarios to be ready for that. So I think there is something, we are really fond of the idea that there will be EU-wide preparedness strategy. This is something that has to be there, and it has not to be only just a paper, but operational document, how we will react, because Europe has been very good in regulating, but on this moment we have to turn on also to this operational level and be good to come over from the peacetime regulating to the real operation ones. And this is something that I think that is really necessary, and that the moment is there. Yeah.
Thank you so much. I want to ask about, you talked about civil resilience and societal preparation. I mean, I'm not a peacenik here, but I want to ask the question, how do you explain to societies, how do you scare them enough without scaring them too much, basically, is my question. I mean, Mark Rutte has said, if you want peace, prepare for war. I mean, other people have been saying this for a long time, but obviously when he says it, it's a headline. people don't want to prepare for war, right? People want to prepare for their August holidays. They want to take off their Friday afternoons. They want to know that everything's safe at school and, you know, their kids don't have to. I mean, people do not want to be told at the 9 o'clock news that we're stockpiling blood and we've got to spend 4% on defense because, you know, the Russians are coming. How do you, at the same time, you need them to be scared to vote for you if your policy is to spend more on defending against the Russians. How do we scare societies enough, but not too much? That's my question. Again, Finland is sort of seen as the best example of this. Scared enough, but not too much. How do you do it? Where's the thin line?
Yeah. Well, another good one, I think. I think obviously if one looks at the European Union now and kind of approaching this, your question from that perspective, different countries, you have different mindsets. And I think the history, as I was referring to legacy, you have the histories, you have different sort of mindsets as far as preparedness or kind of risks are concerned. I mean, of course, for Finland, in a way, the as it's been said also in the public, the Russia threat it's an existential thing. Mm-hmm. And I think most Finns do recognize and understand that it's potentially an existential danger. Mm-hmm. So everything we do around preparedness and everything we kind of, if you like, informing citizens about these things, and also the public debate around security, preparedness, resilience. I think they are kind of considered, well, if not normal, then they kind of are reflection of the time. And I think people kind of understand the gravity of the situation without being too scared. I'm not sure why that is the case exactly, but I think it's the kind of mindset that has been there, and people also understand that when need be, they are ready, more or less, they are ready to defend their country. And I think that informing citizens about these things, in a way, it's not about scaring people. It can be, but it's not necessarily something that needs to be about scaring people, but it's about informing them so that at the end of the day, if you know that the nation is prepared and there is a level of resilience, there are systems in place, there are stockpiles, there are critical infrastructure protection in place, that's also a deterrent. It's a deterrent. It's kind of part of the deterrent, and that's why I like the term comprehensive security. The military is, of course, the crucial component of the deterrent. Obviously, now being part of the alliance, very good thing. Nationally, fairly strong militarily, but the kind of civilian resilience arrangements, if that's the right way to put it, that's part of the deterrent. So it's also communication outside from the country towards the Russians, to be honest. But within the country, I think it's also a sign, an indication that yes, the society is doing its bit in order to also prepare for those very sort of unlikely but scenarios that are very bad for the people, right? But it's the knowledge that people have about those systems. I think it's in a way it kind of eases the mind in a way, because it kind of gives a bit of an reassurance for the people that look, we have those systems, we can continue live our everyday lives, and if something bad happens, then we are more or less prepared. That's, I think, it's of course a lot of psychology around it, and I think one element in preparedness very clearly is the mindset, but it's also the kind of trust and cohesion that needs to be preserved within the society, and that's not an easy part of this discussion either, because there are obviously forces that kind of contribute to increased division and these things that we see. So I think it's also the information space that is extremely crucial, kind of the integrity of information. Overall, it's another topic that we can talk a long time, but I think I just wanted to mention it here as well.
But to Maria's point, no country can stand on its own 2 feet for by itself, right? And so you need your allies to also be prepared in the event of any kind of even medium-term crisis. I dearly wish our Spanish friend was here to talk about the different risk perception. But I mean, ultimately, this has to be a communal effort, right? Otherwise, to your point, Maria, it doesn't matter how well prepared you are as a single state, you're not going to be able to continue without resilience from others. Chris, did you agree with that? I know that Sweden recently put out this pamphlet, you know, about, and it wasn't universally welcomed, but it had the right effect, right?
Yeah, I mean, just to follow up on Janne's points. First of all, I mean, events speak for themselves. Our citizens are consuming media just like we are, and they're seeing similar events that we're discussing here today. And second of all, I mean, in Sweden, what we've seen is more of a gradual introduction of this notion that this is something we need to get ready for. I mean, yesterday or the day before, our prime minister was speaking at the Swedish equivalent of the Munich Security Conference, and there he was saying that we're not at war, but we're not at peace either. That was a quote. And the previous year, our Minister for Civil Defense had said Sweden needs to be prepared for war, and that prompted more of a reaction than what we saw yesterday or the day before.
About softly.
Exactly. So, I mean, there's that element to it. But also, I think, and indeed, you mentioned the pamphlet that was distributed to 4-point-something million households in Sweden a couple of weeks ago. It's both about communicating a risk picture for obviously armed conflict, but also extreme weather, pandemics. There's also mention of organized crime, etc. So it's conveying the message that this is one among several very serious types of risks that we need to be prepared for. It also sends the message to citizens that there's a lot that you as an individual can do yourself. It's empowering, the message in the pamphlet. It points to specific types of investments you can make in your neighborhood, in your household, at the individual level. Do you know first aid, etc., things like that. And finally, I'm just kind of linking back to the EU level. We have something called Prepare EU. It's an initiative that's ongoing now, that's being led by DG ECHO. And
always an initiative, right?
This stems from the Swedish presidency. No, but what it does is it looks to facilitate a discussion amongst member states about how do we raise risk awareness across the union. And obviously that risk picture is going to look very different from one country to the next, but there's a very interesting discussion ongoing right now about what that looks like and what's going to be done at the EU level and what can be done at the member state level.
Yes, I will keep on from here because, or actually going back to this people's feeling, because I think we are the country that we don't need to explain people that they have to be ready. It's much more about how they can be ready. It's for the companies, certainly. It's cybersecurity also we haven't really talking about, but it's certainly something that we have been explaining for the companies, trying to help them to build up their systems, but also on the citizen level. For sure, many people, we see that they are joining a voluntary, either like civil protection or military protection organization, and they want to be useful for the society. And for everyone, we have been like, there is an app, typical thing, but we have an app for everyone to understand what are the basic things, what you need to have for your family, what are the medicine, how can you prepare. I think it's kind of essential because people in those critical situations, or if they hear some news, they would like to be a bit more secure. I think that maybe it's also that, yeah, our people believe in their state or in the government, but from the other side, we constantly have the feeling we have to be prepared ourselves. You can never be just constantly believing that the state can provide for everybody. So I think that it's very important to go to the citizen level and explain what can you do for yourself.
Ambassador, I'm struck. I remember in sort of December 2021, January 2022, the Americans, the Brits, the Baltic countries, Poland were saying the intelligence suggests there's an invasion coming. And there were some countries in Europe, we don't need to go over them, who were saying, no, it's going to be fine. That'd be crazy. President Zelensky was saying there's not going to be an invasion publicly. Was that part of what sort of we've been touching on here, this idea that you cannot tell societies there's going to be a war? You've got to make sure that they're preparing for the worst, but they're not panicking. I mean, how has Ukraine managed that preparation versus panic, not just in the 6 weeks or 2 months before the full-scale invasion, but over the last 3 years? How do you draw that line, and how can EU and NATO countries learn from it?
I think, Henry, this is actually the hard question. What is the balance between not creating panic and not, to then the borders will be, overflooded with people, and then who will stay in the end, if we are talking about defending the country. And the other thing is about how to make, so to say, the preparation for the worst scenario. So in our case, yes, we were trying, so to say, to strike some kind of a balance. Part of it, actually, I will confess to you, part of it was that we really believed till the last day that, that the worst scenario can be evaded, frankly. So even looking at the different intelligence reports, there was still a perception that we can evade the military solution, because for different reasons, and I will not stop on that because it would be another discussion, but there was a reasoning among many people that the worst will not happen in the end. Another thing was that we were trying, of course, to reallocate some of our, for example, planes, our military units, but making it also cover it, not, to show to Russians that we are trying also to prepare. So this was also one thing, and that is why the capital withstand, and there was not that the Russians, this breakthrough, then they looked at 3 days to get Kiev. It actually everything collapsed and failed. But again, I think this is something that we should also look at while we are talking about preparedness, because frankly, colleagues, I think it's quite understandable that people understand the danger and are prepared in countries like Estonia, Lithuania, Poland, Finland, Sweden, and some others. But believe me, when we are talking about, so to say, countries which are geographically located far away from the Russian Federation, the perception of the threat is very much diminished. So that is why for my colleagues, for example, in NATO, it's also difficult to defend, to increase the defense spending, because people really, they don't want to believe that the war is coming, that Russia can invade. For them, it's of course, they would like to keep their social things, salaries, pensions, going on weekends and so on and so on. So the social, so to say, benefits are standing here. And this is very difficult to convince that can be another scenario. And that to spend for defense is about actually prosperity in the long run for everybody. And also making the compliments to what was mentioned by my colleagues. I, for example, received also a special brochure from my Finnish colleague in NATO. So she kindly shared with me. And I mean, I was looking through already with my experience, what kind of, smart advices are there about, having cash in your at home, because it was a problem, believe me, in Ukraine. You for the first days of invasion, so people were struggling that they cannot receive cash, they cannot, put the gasoline in their car, so they are not prepared with the papers. And then they were approaching the borders, the Polish people and Polish borders, they were going crazy about us because people were coming even not without foreign passports, about generators, and so on and so on. So when I look at this simple things with my experience of 3 years, I believe that this is already evidence that you are good preparing for the worst scenario. Of course, let's believe that it will not happen, but be prepared. This is something that we should do.
So much. I want to come back to the NATO EU coordination thing. I know we joke about Prepare EU and Task Force. I'm sure it's got a great social media platform. You talked about, is it Resilience Committee in NATO? Never knew that existed. Planning groups, Task Force, continual cooperation, blah, 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 blah. The previous Secretary of NATO, Jens Stoltenberg, on his way out, was quite critical about attempts by the EU to sort of muscle in on NATO competence, or the way he saw it at least. Is there a danger that too many cooks spoil the broth? And actually, you need one task force, one set of rules, one set of guidelines. And actually, while it's all good that there are multiple people trying to help, if you have 9 different sets of recommendations, you're going to end up with 9 different systems. And that's not going to be good. I mean, where does cooperation become undermining? And actually, and perhaps I would love to hear your experience from Ukraine, is it better just to have one committee, one set of rules, one set of approaches?
I don't, I don't really, so to say, I'm not worried about, so to say, competition between EU and NATO. I believe that they can really complement each other in terms of actually building resilience, even defense spending, many things. Because in fact, from my experience, NATO is the masterpiece, is an expert of elaborating certain principles like guidelines, what should be done, what is the example, what are the proper procedures. But the financial, so to say, leverage is in the EU. So to implement good things, you should support it with the financial background. And that is why I believe that it should be really maybe not a one task force, but certainly something more unified of trying to coordinate all the efforts which is going on. And also a bit of my bitter, so to say, experience. When we were talking in Ukraine during the industrial forum, we were talking about 2 different defense production people. And believe me, they were really complaining that they cannot, for example, speed up production because of different limitations within the EU legislation about, green things, about export control, strict procedures. And, I was a bit concerned when we started 3 years ago talking about these problems. And unfortunately, 3 years after, people are complaining about the same things. So I have already, so to say, the operational proposal for both EU and NATO to stand together on that. And then we will be not complaining about the legislation or the rules that we created, but how we can simplify them to streamline them if war is coming.
Well, picking from that topic, there's no silver bullet for resilience. And I think it's fair to say that no single committee or an initiative or a task force, that's not going to be enough. I mean, they probably have their place in their sort of a setting, and that's good. But there's no one kind of solution that is enough. I think both NATO and EU need to play an important role, and they are playing an important role in ensuring security in Europe and elsewhere. So I think it's about complementarities. At the end of the day, NATO is a collective defense alliance. They have a fairly clear mandate in a way at the end of the day. And EU is all about regulation and money. And that those instruments can be smartly deployed and used for the purposes of security. be it economic security and in a way more kind of traditional security, in the sense that we are kind of improving European preparedness and resilience. And I would like to kind of take up this point on the risk landscape, if you like, and the kind of a different threats and risks that the different member states, the European countries see as relevant for themselves, because it's very clear and understandable that for us here, in fact, all of the countries on the podium, the risk of a military conflict and in a way the kind of an adversary from the east is at the moment something which is in a way the most pressing kind of a risk. Be it hybrid.
Just wait for Donald Trump to invade Greenland, though, and then.
Well, that's why I in the beginning I was saying that there's a huge wave of change, right? Yes. So there can be some other things that we need to take into account, and geopolitics is one, right? And it's the kind of an we often talk about black swans. But there are a lot of other swans around in the kind of a global arena right now that can be important from the perspective of resilience. But to be a bit more on a serious note, we can still, and I think there's a very good case, a strong case for common action at EU level, irrespective of the kind of fact whether these threats are shared exactly or not, because it's really the kind of a consequence that is important. So for instance, if one talks about the availability of critical materials, one talks about the vulnerabilities that are kind of embedded in the global value chains and the critical value chains. So those are equally important for Spain as well as for Finland. And by the way, I should kind of advertise a project that we are just about to kick off with our colleagues in Spain in trying to identify sort of those critical value chains that can be important for both countries from the security of supply perspective. The kind of a root cause for a disruption can be different, but the kind of a consequence and the impact can be kind of in a similar way kind of serious, right? And there's a good case for preparedness, in other words, regardless of the root cause of the possible disruption. It doesn't. This, of course, this kind of an thinking doesn't apply to everything, but I think we can do a lot at the EU level and across the member states, and doesn't always have to be the kind of, if you like, the frontline countries. We need to do our particular things, and Europe needs to also understand that if there was a military conflict on a greater scale, even on a greater scale than what is going on right now, involving NATO countries, involving EU countries, that would be obviously a major issue for the whole Europe, right? So there would be consequences, if not direct and so serious immediately, there would be consequences for the whole of Europe. So it's our common sort of a challenge as well.
I fully agree with that. I think it's one of the best things to say that, yeah, risk scenarios regionally might be different, but the consequences might be the same, and we have to work with them. But going back to the EU and NATO, we're fully in line with the report that there has to be a clear processes how to act. But I wanted to say also good words about this report, what you have there, because I would have said some words about our emergency law, but it's nicely described there, because it's also important that on a national level, you think on comprehensive crisis, that it's not important whether it's military or whether it's somewhere hybrid or whether it's a natural catastrophe or something that we changed the last year. the understanding that we have one Security Council led by Prime Minister, because it's natural that certain, at least in small states, you have to look at the resources on a comprehensive or a holistic way, because even in any organization, we see that we have to understand which persons will work for the military side, which for the civil side, if something is happening. And sometimes the competencies are very few. You have only one or two persons who can do it. So you have to be determined how will we operate on a certain situation. I would say I'm very much down to earth on my comments, but I think it's something that we have to think that it's not great stories about EU and NATO, but it also comes back to the business and institutional level. How will we act to make this EU and NATO cooperation actually working in their really everyday level?
Yeah, sure, do you?
Yeah, and actually my comments link up very nicely with yours because they're very nitty gritty. I mean, and that's what I was thinking in response to your question. I mean, first of all, we have to put in the work. Coordination between two institutions like this take time. They take a lot of energy, they take resources, and they take a lot of Outlook invitations back and forth to make the meetings happen. And that's something we need to account for, how we budget, how we plan, how we dimension the different coordination functions, et cetera. It's a wonky reflection, but it's important. If we don't have that, we don't have the EU-NATO collaboration working. And the other one is just believe in the process. I mean, I'm just thinking about the EU legislative cycle. And I was involved in the negotiations around the Critical Entities Resilience Directive. And what you see in practice is that EU member states come to the table with their perspectives that reflect membership in NATO. They're thinking about NATO implications in implementing EU legislation. So, I mean, these issues, the potential overlaps, a lot of them work themselves out in the context of negotiations, et cetera. So we talk a lot about what happens between the EU and NATO, but again, we need to be thinking about the role that member states / allies play in making sure that link up and that complementarity is achieved. And then finally, kind of just getting back to what both of you were discussing in terms of interdependencies. I mean, I'm just thinking again about the preparedness union strategy that everyone's looking forward to. And, what are we going to see from the Commission concerning, the EU risk assessment? What are we going to see about the analytical capacities that need to be put in place to make sure that everyone, 27 member states, are seeing the interdependencies that exist amongst themselves? That's an important role for the EU, but also NATO to play in different contexts. So we're looking forward to seeing what the concrete proposal is concerning that.
Forgive me for being cynical, but it's my job. NATO's had stockpiling rules for weapons for a very, very long time, and February 2022 showed that nobody actually followed the rules, and we had half-empty warehouses, and the ones that were full with the wrong stuff. How do you make countries actually do what they're? I mean, it's all well and good sitting around a table and say, yes, we must prepare, and these are great lists, and a million tins of baked beans and whatever. There's a question here. Did the pandemic show governments that this stuff isn't just make-believe, that you can't just have a nice strategy and a department of preparedness and lists, and actually you need this stuff. You need boxes and boxes and boxes and boxes of face masks. I mean, stuff that no one even thinks about anymore, but Europe was going to collapse, right? Because there weren't enough face masks. Has the three of you, and then please, very keen to hear about that. How did the pandemic change the way governments think, from best practice to actually practicing best practice?
Yes, sure. Because I have to start that our stockpiling agency was basically built up at that time, because
Didn't have one before.
We had the one that was responsible for this fuel, 90 days of fuel reserve. And we had different areas where we had medicine, certainly, but now the understanding came that it's not that, it's much better to have it in one organization, because then they are ready for different kind of crisis. And I think this was the lesson learned from the COVID, that we understood that it has to be in one hands, and now we are more trying to build it as also a competence center that could be ready for that. Yes, but I think that the COVID crisis, I remember during the night buying together with my minister those face masks from China. Just really, literally, that was the situation. You are never ready for something, but what I would say, what I earlier also mentioned, is the question about regulation. And I think EU has to also learn how to react quickly. It's maybe not the great example, but still we got the mask that wouldn't have been applicable with the CU marking and whatever. No, we checked. We checked many of them by the laboratories. They meet the standards, but they didn't have the way how you put the product on the market, because there was no CU marking. We checked many, and I wouldn't say that all were good, but I would say that most of them were just according to our standard, because we were looking precisely what are the standards, how to. We had a lot of help from different organizations. How could you measure and how you could test? But this is something also that most probably our stockpiles will never be fully ready for all of the situation. What happened then, we have to have a problem solving like the mindset how to do it. But certainly COVID helped, and so sad to say Ukraine has taught us a lot how to be more prepared.
Well, I think the COVID story certainly was I could call it a wake-up call, one of those famous wake-up calls for the governments, absolutely, in terms of preparedness overall. But one also has to understand that the COVID was one thing, and now we have the military conflict, we have the war in Ukraine, and the kind of way to prepare for a full-scale war is a whole different story again. So you would need to take different things into consideration. Of course, the basic philosophy, I think, is the same. You need to be prepared. But with all honesty, I don't think that in case of COVID, obviously one has to prepare for unlikely events and those events that have kind of high impact sort of scenarios or high impact events. And COVID certainly was one of those things. But it's also important to understand that the scarcity around the face masks that sort of came about because the same thing, the demand was kind of exponential all over at the same time. So it was a very specific issue in a way, and the demand was unprecedented all over Europe, in Northern America, all at the same time. So there was no way that you could kind of guarantee a normal supply of those products in the early months of the pandemic. We had our own hiccups also in that space for the first few months of the pandemic, but we were able to, at the end of the day, within a half a year, procure those boxes to massive amounts, because that was a special task that was given to our agency at the time. And by the way, now we have still, if anybody is interested, we are happy to happy to make those available. But I mean, seriously, it's a challenge around building stockpiles. It can be a temporary solution. It's necessary, but it's always something that is a short-term solution. It's something that serves as a last resort kind of solution due to the availability of a critical product or a material. But you need to find other ways to kind of guarantee that you also kind of can source the product in question on a longer term. So it's a question of setting up domestic production, as many countries, by the way, did, of course, in the course of the pandemic for the face masks. But if you think this in broader terms and preparing for military conflict, it's a whole different story and much more complex than simply talking about few products.
Absolutely, better this way around though than the other way around, right? I mean, you also saw the way the EU responded. You know, massive amounts of power flowing to this town away from other cities, a trust from member state capitals that Brussels could fix it, or at least could have a go at trying to fix it, and it was successful, especially with vaccines. Joint borrowing, you know, all this stuff that now we talk about as a solution for defense grew out of pandemic crisis response. The pandemic also brings me to natural disasters. I mean, they're not, whatever, viruses, natural disasters. I assumed that our colleague from the European Parliament would want to talk about the floods in Spain recently, but natural disasters and calamities, let's say, a good way of making people think about this from a non-military point of view. How, perhaps you could talk about this in Sweden. I mean, how I hesitate to say, oh, we should talk about the sort of soft stuff to try and slip in the military stuff, but is that sort of a part of what's going on here? You know, preparedness is total, but if you don't want to scare people with the idea of war, you can say, well, look, there are floods, there are wildfires, there are earthquakes. There are not many earthquakes in Europe, but you know,
They're quite scary as well.
They're very scary, especially if it happens in your village, right?
Just looking at it from a Swedish standpoint, I mean, in 2004 we had the tsunami, which killed around, I believe, it was 600 Swedes in Thailand, and that kind of prompted a rethink in terms of how do we do crisis management in Sweden. And then in the coming years, we had, you know, the migration crisis, which was obviously a pan-European incident, but it had implications for Sweden. The pandemic, terrorist attacks, forest fires, including some where we had, you know, hundreds of Polish firefighters coming to Sweden to help us put out fires. So we've had our share of fairly significant societal disruptions in recent decades, which have put us in a better position to do crisis management generally, the quote unquote softer stuff, as you put it. But now, obviously, given events, we need to transition to include and make sure that our contingency planning covers this. It's not a new contingency, but we need to give it more focus, you know, and the new narrative in my agency is we do crisis and war. So we cover the spectrum, but we're for the time being, at least, we're emphasizing war as one of our main contingencies that we need to be particularly prepared for. So indeed, I think the fact that we've had this journey in the last 2 decades in terms of crisis preparedness puts us in a better position to be ready for something like this. Yeah.
Maybe you could talk a bit about the stuff that you're hearing now from colleagues in the EU and NATO about preparing societies. Did Ukraine go through a hyper fast process to get to where we are now, or was this something that was happening 2 decades ago, which Europe's now going through now? I mean, could you talk a bit about the societal preparation? How, or was this, I don't want to use the word miracle, but was this something that Ukraine did unexpectedly? The government hadn't prepared for the societal resilience. It just happened. I mean, how do we learn from that process? That we're talking here about, you know, 2 decades.
Frankly, you know, everything because when the colleagues were talking about COVID, I was thinking that, like, you know, a very distant past already, because everything in comparison, just, you know, just actually like a glimpse of history in comparison what we have now, sincerely. And if we're talking about society, you know, my people surprised me 3 years ago, and they are still surprising me so far, because you know, many people, even like my European colleagues, were asking me, like, after 1 year of the war or 2 years, like, are people really tired in Ukraine? Because, like, we are tired in our societies because of the war, because of the so much spending on military support to Ukraine. And, you know, I think when you are especially sitting in the trenches, you are the person who can be tired. Everybody else, we just don't have a right to be tired. So this is so to say not our right to be tired, because we should deliver on other jobs. And here, I believe this is something that should also be understood in the society, that if, for example, some people are at the front line, then the other part of the society should do their job at home. if you are, doing your job, you are paying taxes, so you are making also voluntarily allocation of money after your salary, but like helping volunteers funds to help, for example, buy drones for Ukrainian soldiers. This is something that I also call it resilience, and also understanding that the fate of your country is at stake. So usually, sometimes I believe that maybe politicians, they underestimate a bit of the mood of population and their resilience. But in the end, it just happened everything on the opposite. So people are not tired. They can be angry. They can be really angry at Russians. They can be really angry that now the situation on the battlefield is not going up to our plans so far, and that the winter is really hard in terms of local blackouts in different cities. But still, I will not call it desperation or tiredness or whatever. So this is something about also the morale. I don't have a recipe for you how to build it up, because again, for me, many things came also as a surprise. So I thought that maybe after 1 or 2 years, that would be, the completed, our resources will be exhausted, but this is not the case. And I think this is something that also Putin underestimated a lot in terms of looking at Ukraine, but he also underestimated the Western resilience, because he really believed with his team that the reaction to the war in Ukraine would be the same as with the occupation of Crimea back in 2014. So he believed that there would be a bunch of, statements expressing concerns, and that would be the end of it. But for the 3 years already, so we built up a coalition of more than 50 countries in so-called Rammstein group. We are still receiving military, financial help, humanitarian help in energy infrastructure. We are also trying to do our part, as I said. So this is something that that should be in place in order to withstand.
I interviewed Admiral Bauer earlier this month, the CMC at NATO, who didn't print it in the newspaper, but he said to me, what people aren't realizing is that once a war begins, within about 3 or 4 days, politicians have to go to the society and say, we need more people because people are dying. So we need to replenish the armed forces. Is this an area of preparedness in Europe that hasn't been discussed yet? And is it not being discussed because it's too difficult, or because people aren't completely thinking through the entire chain? I mean, I do not hear politicians in Europe saying, if there is an armed conflict, we need to be aware that we are going to lose citizens and we're going to need citizens to go to the front. This talk of conscription, I mean, I know Finland has a fantastic national service program. I mean, is this something that needs to be talked about more? The human preparedness, not boxes and boxes of baked beans and blood, but blood inside people.
Well, I think that's an important, yet an extremely serious aspect of preparedness, especially preparedness or preparing for a military conflict. But I mean, in the Finnish case, we have a reserve army. I mean, it's not only a conscription service, but those that have come through the training, they are then having their position in the defense planning, in the troops, and they are in the reserve. And we have more or less 250,000 men ready to go. Right. So it's not a theoretical thing.
Not so much. I would say
I wouldn't say. Yeah, I don't know if that's an exception. Maybe that's something that is very characteristic for the frontline countries, right? Otherwise, the army is or tends to be kind of professional army. So that's obviously where I think this question comes into play. If a broader kind of a large scale military conflict would emerge.
Yeah, I just say we have the same system that we have still obligatory military service, and now a lot of extra training for reserve people. So this is the part of the story, definitely, but it's no one ready to go to war. That's also clear that it's the readiness to protect your country, it's there, but we most probably mentally still need to be understanding what does it mean. And this is what is constantly done also in this reserve training, because most of the people who have been in the military service, like let's say 10 years ago, they were really not thinking in the concept that it's actual war might be coming. So it's important to train and train again.
Yeah, and I mean, in Sweden, we kept military conscription throughout the 90s, even though the numbers were far smaller than in previous decades. And in recent years, we brought back civilian conscription, like I mentioned earlier. And when we talk about civilian conscription today, we're talking about boosting the numbers in terms of rescue services that can work in war conditions specifically. And this is very much based on the lessons of our colleagues in the state emergency service in Ukraine, the challenges that they've encountered in operating in that type of environment. But we're also bringing back civilian conscription for other types of niche capacities. One is energy repair. So teams that are able to go out and repair energy infrastructure quickly that's been damaged, for instance, in war. But we're also, and this is something that was announced during this ongoing conference up in northern Sweden right now, is, there were also, we've been tasked with looking at, can we bring in 18-year-olds, just like we bring in 18-year-olds on the military side, can we bring in 18-year-olds to support rescue services and other capacities? So, I mean, it's happening gradually in different fairly specific areas. But we do have on the books legislation, a total defense law, and that allows for authorities to draw on the entirety of the Swedish population, including foreign citizens living in Sweden between the ages of 16 and 70. So this law gives authorities certain powers to use other elements of the population in the event of need. So, but that law has been on the books for some time, but now we collectively, and particularly the political level, is communicating more about the fact that this exists, and this was communicated in this most recent pamphlet, for instance, that you mentioned. But in terms of can we draw on others in supporting us or other affected countries? I mean, again, I'm going to raise the Union Civil Protection Mechanism, an example of, this isn't citizens, but this is rather capacities that exist at European level that member states can request and that can potentially, depending on the circumstances, be deployed to affected countries. We have something called Rescue, and we also have a voluntary pool of capacity. So these are just two types of examples of teams and people that can be brought to bear, again, depending on the circumstances.
I'm keen to get questions from the audience, but you'll have to suffer one more annoying one from me. I want to talk about populism. I appreciate none of you guys are politicians, but that there is a very easy way for this all to fall apart, which is for politicians to say the easy thing, which is, we shouldn't be spending money on this. We don't need to worry about threats. This is all blown up. These are warmongers. We're seeing this in countries. Germany is a good example right now, but not just that. Hungary as well, Slovakia. How much of a threat to preparedness is what I will broadly determine as the rise of the far right, rise of extremism in Europe, populism, essentially parties saying the easy thing, which is not necessarily true, but they could argue is, which is that we don't need to prepare for this stuff and we should just be friends with everyone. The Donald Trump, will just have peace in Europe and that'll be fine approach. I mean, is this about preparing, but not preparing so fast and so expensively that you rise up opposition to it politically? I appreciate it's a difficult question for civil servants, but please try.
Shall I try? Well, I mean, populism is something that can be, I think, understood against the background that world is very complicated. It's very complex, and the challenges are very complex. And if you are a populist or a kind of populist politician, you normally kind of offer very simplistic solutions, and that can be very appealing. So one has to understand that that kind of is one aspect and one element within the democratic system. So it's up for the serious people in a way to kind of defend the democracy and to kind of argue for the real problems, but argue for the real solutions as well. And for the fact that unfortunately there is no silver bullet for the complex set of problems. Well, that's at least the principle. Obviously, in practice, we see a lot of this going on right now, and I think it's something that is itself a threat to democracy. And somehow we need to step up our kind of action. And that's why I mentioned the information space, because I think information, integrity of information, also the way the media behaves is important. And obviously the social media, the new technology, it's something that people are only learning to kind of become accustomed to in a way, right? Let's hope that people learn before something nasty happens, right? From the perspective of preserving Western values and the democracy. That much I can say, even as a civil servant. So that's why I also referred to this huge wave of change. So we need to be prepared for all kinds of things. And I think defending democracy is extremely important in this context.
You look around the table at NATO, the 32 countries.
No, of course, NATO is not a, so to say, a single-minded alliance. There is a lot has been done and still is going on to keep the solidarity and the unity at sometimes, unfortunately, at the expense, when the smart decisions are, for example, are partial and are not adopted at all. But this is something, we accept because this is the political, so to say, reality. And as to your question, for me, the answer is very simple. Politicians, they behave like populists because they want to be elected and then to be re-elected and maybe fortunately re-elected again if the legislation allows or whatever. So this is the difference between them and actually the people whom I call, for example, statesman. When the statesman is in a position that he has to adopt unpopular decision, but he believes that this is in favor of his country and even at the expense of his own electoral rate. So this is, I think, the big difference. What we see now in some countries that you mentioned is exactly this situation. So people are in anxiety. There is a lot of this appetite for the simple decision. And then are coming people who are speaking, the words that are so favorable to your ears, saying that everything will be very good, just perfect, that everybody should come down, that Ukraine experience will not come like to your door because we are far away, not interested for Russia, whatever. So the arguments can be very different. And this appetite is here, what can we say? And that is why I agree with my colleagues who mentioned that the role of media, the role of journalists, the role of experts and different non-governmental activists is very crucial in that sense. To be in the position to say the truth when it's not, very pleasant to hear, this is something also about to be brave and to have your position in this life. So that is why, again, societies should be reformed. And then if the society would be in a robust, so to say, state, then it would be less appetite for populists.
Question you had. is absolutely vital. But from the sort of civil servants' perspective, of those who are planning conceptually what preparedness means, how much of preparedness
You have to have both. I mean, you can't say that the public doesn't play a role in this. And I mean, in listening to your question, I was thinking about some very concrete examples. I mean, first of all, there's a lot of structural work that can be done where the public doesn't need to be involved. I mean, there's a lot of work in terms of the interplay between different government agencies and private providers of essential services, for instance, where that is very much about getting the structural relationships right so that the quote unquote lights stay on in different scenarios. And there, obviously, the public doesn't have a particularly large role to play. But then, you know, I mean, and then there's, for instance, on the public side, there's the manpower issue, you know, in the event of a very particularly serious, I mean, this gets back to the conscription, for instance. You need manpower to keep the lights on. You need manpower for obviously the military effort, but also the civilian effort. You need people to go to work and take care of children in the preschools and the kindergartens, for instance. I mean, all of this needs to be covered. And then another is, and this is something we work particularly actively on right now, is ensuring that in different types of crises, members of the public don't, quote unquote, overload the system. You know, I mean, we need to make sure that individuals are making decisions such that they don't create an undue burden on essential services when they need to be working at their most efficient. And one example is, for instance, on keeping household supplies at home for 7 days, so that you don't have to be running to the grocery stores and you know when things might be thin on the shelves. So these are just two examples of where, you know, you have to have both, but maybe the engagement between government and the citizen and other types of actors looks very different depending on the issue that's being discussed.
Well, the Finnish experience, the model absolutely the same as my Swedish colleague. Obviously, both are important, but maybe a point and a word about preparedness. We started with the terminology thing, so maybe I'll come back to that. That's what we actually mean by preparedness. Preparedness is something that needs to be done in advance of the crisis, in advance of the actual event. So this preparedness is kind of useless if you do it in the midst of the crisis. Right. So, for instance, the kind of readiness plans for the different levels of authorities, different kind of actors, those need to be done in advance in order for them to be effective at all. And that's why I also mentioned the kind of an practice and exercising those plans. And I know that obviously the kind of state systems or the government systems can be quite complicated, especially at the federal level. But that's why preparedness is so important, because that you can do before the crisis hits. And that's the reason why we put quite a bit of emphasis on doing things hopefully in advance, and obviously hopefully avoiding the crisis to materialize at all. This kind of individual citizens' role absolutely crucial, because it's really preparedness kind of consists of 3 actors or levels: individual citizens, the business sector and the critical businesses in the critical sectors, and then thirdly, the kind of complementary action that can be put into place by the state or by the authorities. And by one example is the stockpiles. You can kind of create an additional layer of protection with the purpose of, for instance, ensuring that certain critical materials, their availability is kind of ensured. So it's a kind of a whole range of issues, and you need all these levels. Obviously, we have this recommendation. Sweden has stretched this to 7 days, right? But we only at the moment still talk about 72 hours. So we have a concept of 72 hours, which is kind of broadly, the information is broadly available and distributed to individual citizens. 72h.fi is in fact the place where you can get quite a bit of information on citizens' preparedness. And it's kind of advice on how you prepare for different types of crisis, what you need to be storing at home in order to be able to kind of survive 3 days or without going to the grocery store or things like that. And there's in fact a debate ongoing whether this is too short. Too short or not in view of the present security environment and the challenges. Not sure if I responded or answered to your question, but that's obviously important. But and I think for the individual citizens, it's also about understanding the risks to a sufficient degree. You don't have to be an expert, but hopefully people kind of understand the risk landscape and the environment where they live sufficiently in order to kind of be able to contribute their part to preparedness.
Yes, a lot has been said, but I was thinking also one more dimension, what we haven't been talking, it's the local governments. And we have now just lately done a, I would say, qualified study. It's not like quantity, but it's just interviews, colleague from the stockpiling agency, they did interviews of local governments to understand the readiness there, because we see that we can talk with citizens readiness, but if something happens, it's not even about military, it's much more also about natural disasters, that the first like front line is a local government, and we have tried to understand how are they ready, what are they ready, and at least with these interviews to kind of raise their awareness. And we see with many it's very good, but there are ones that especially need help, or at least understanding and rethinking what will work, how will work, because they might be the first line to help the people if they don't have housing or whatever. So it's many layers.
You have anything to add on coordination? Gentleman here in the corner.
Would you mind, before giving the floor to the gentleman, just we have a few questions from our online audience. If we can take those as well. But I think there are 2 questions. I think they go in one direction. So there's an interest question for Mr. Känkänen. So Federica Fazio asks that you mentioned that the EU is primarily about negotiations and money. And she asks you, how do you foresee Article 42.7 of the Treaty on the European Union fitting into this perspective, and how can EU and NATO clarify the relationship between their respective collective defense clauses?
Is it just about money and regulation? Where's the EU army?
Well, yeah, but we do have NATO. So so let's I just simply wanted to kind of point out the fact that I think it would be kind of a good idea to work based on the current division of labor and capabilities. I mean, NATO is a natural kind of actor for making sure that we have collective defense. That's good. We have EU, and that also has its kind of legacy systems. And I think it's obviously been very focusing on economics, making sure that there's prosperity around in Europe. And that's, in fact, another side of the coin, if you like, of preparedness as well. You need to ensure that we as Europe, prosper economically. That's, by the way, the best vaccine also against the threats to democracy. And that's why Europe and EU is so important in ensuring that the EU stays prosperous, but also relevant in the global context, as far as the kind of geopolitics, but even more, maybe even more importantly, the global kind of economy context. So maybe not going to dwell on the articles of the treaty at this point, but this is how I kind of approach it in a kind of simple way. But it's a kind of a complementary action that the EU is extremely and can be an extremely positive and important force for security and preparedness, if it wants to be. And I think there's now an increasing will to do so, and I think it's very positive. So let's work on that. It can be through regulation, but it can be through smart use of European funds.
We can go to the man. I think Finland and Sweden joining NATO is probably the best indictment of 42.7. Yes, the question here, and then a question here from the lady in the blue. We'll take two at the same time. Thank you.
Thank you very much indeed. Ignacio from European Commission, speaking in private capacity. A question about division of labor and everybody doing their job. And actually, in this room a few months ago, Alexander Stubb, the Finnish president, was drawing a beautiful picture of golden triangle between NATO, between EU, and the member states or the NATO allies. And for me, this is basically the three sides of the same coin, if you allow me the expression. Now, again, you mentioned as concerns the EU, the regulatory power, the money. Christer mentioned SIR and NIS initiatives, which is basically about the preparedness. But the fact is that back in November, European Commission has started respectively 23 and 24 infringement procedures against member states for transposition or non-transposition of these directives. So my question here is, now that the Commission is, actually when the Commission will come up with a beautiful list, a brilliant list of 30 or 40 initiatives in the framework of the Preparedness Union strategy, how to make sure that we don't end up with 23 or 24 infringement procedures times 30 or 40, random number, that this is not being translated into reality. Thank you very much.
Question. Thank you. And the lady here in the blue blazer. Yeah.
Thank you. My name is Alice Stolmeyer, founder and executive director of Defend Democracy. Great to hear that the panel said that defending democracy is crucial for preparedness. We actually have a program working on preparedness and civil resilience to especially facilitate this cross-EU and cross-NATO learning among civil society. It's called Coalition for Democratic Resilience. I can tell more bilaterally, but my question is, and I'm not sure who is best placed to answer it, but what are the panel's thoughts about digital infrastructure being critical infrastructure? I'm thinking in particular about Elon Musk, who is already interfering in EU democracy right now via X, and apparently is even considering to buy now also TikTok. So in the context of preparedness, shouldn't we also ensure European digital sovereignty?
Great question. Who wants to take the infringement ones? And I think the ambassador plus one should take the one on digital resilience.
Okay, that's a nice, good division of labor. On the regulation side, I think my simple answer would be to kind of prevent that from happening, the kind of a disaster scenario. I think you might want to use less regulation, less directives, right? Regulation done in a smart way can be an important tool, but I mean, preparedness and security cannot be solved through regulation only. So use regulation smartly. That would be my answer. Why I'm saying this is that the Finnish kind of experience and the example suggests that we have for a long kind of enabled an systematic platform for making sure that critical companies in Finland, businesses and the public sector can interact in issues relevant for preparedness and security of supply. This is a system that is not based on legislation, it's based on a practice, it's based on trust, and it's based on a kind of an incentive for the companies to participate in the work of that network. Basically comes from the fact that they want to be good corporate citizens. They want to contribute to kind of Finnish comprehensive security. Of course, it's not a recipe for everybody, and we recognize that this is a very Finnish specific thing, but it might be something that could be kind of a, if not the direct model, but I think it might be a good idea for Europe to kind of learn from that type of cooperation practices, rather than saying through regulation that you need to report on these and these and these things. You need to have a strategy, a preparedness strategy or a readiness strategy of this and this and this kind for these and these companies. That's something that may be important and relevant in some cases, but in a more broad picture, if one talks about the role of the companies and critical companies, because it is very critical. Most of the critical infrastructure is owned, operated, and handled by private sector and private companies, and that's why we put a lot of emphasis on that cooperation, but not through regulatory means.
I would go on as a lawyer in this case, and I would say that knowing that harmonizing EU laws, I mean, in our case, we are also lagging behind with NIS2, although are very, very important for us. There's no doubt about it. But I had to say as a lawyer that we can't start harmonizing if there is not the last implementing or delegating act on the table. So I would think that it would be so much better to have a concise picture and then have the time to take it. Because in our case, if you change something in between, I have seen it, I'm not expert of NIS2 or whatever, but I've seen in other areas that if you have a framework directive and then in months to come, there are many other things that are putting the details. In our case, in our law, the last one in, then we can really start working. So it would be like, we are not against regulating some of the areas or putting a minimum standard, but it would be lovely then to agree, this is it. And now we have the time, let's say 2 years or whatever. And some of the regulation has also been very quickly put on the table that you have to do it very quickly. And it will take, because our legal system is totally different. So we have to really work how to put it into our system so that it will actually work. But yes, going to maybe another topic is about media and democracy. I think that we have felt, again, not being the expert of it, of the, again, totally new concept, how to avoid, for example, Russian TV channels shown in some of the countries. So we are experiencing this, and maybe someone else can elaborate on more, but we have to think on this side also, if it's so far already in those concepts like Russian TV.
Cybersecurity.
I could just follow up on the infringement. I think it's quite an interesting question, because I mean, if we talk about the Critical Entities Resilience Directive, at the time at which that legislation was put forward, things were fairly quiet on the critical infrastructure front, and then Nord Stream happened, and that was kind of the turning point in which all of a sudden everything critical infrastructure related was on the table. And the same people that are involved in dealing with the operational side of understanding the implications are the people involved in the implementation of the directive, which influences the timeline. But it also points to the intricacy and the complexity of what we're talking about here. I'm not going to get into the weeds about this directive, but I mean, it covers 11 sectors. And that at the member state level is a real challenge, trying to understand what that means at national level and what national legislation needs to be tweaked or entirely changed in order for this to be implementable. So, I mean, it's a really complex issue. It's not an excuse, but it's part of the context. And kind of getting back to Janne's point, I think it also points to the importance of having a really good working dialogue with the Commission and other EU stakeholders about what's needed in terms of legislation and other types of softer measures. I'm not saying the CER directive isn't needed. I'm just saying, you know, I mean, we need to have that constant dialogue to make sure that we're getting on the table what member states need at a certain point in time.
Maybe I will mention just briefly on your question about different platforms, social media. No, I think that there is something also a big question mark for us all. What is the perfect balance between, you know, democracy and censorship on certain things? And this is something that we struggled also with our own, so to say, citizens. I will give you a very practical, simple example. After some massive attacks at the beginning of the war, there were people who were doing streaming from the places. There were people who were making photos, and no, I'm afraid they were not even realizing that in that sense they are not, you know, informing, so to say, their friends and relatives and other Ukrainians, but they are playing into the hands of the Russian aggressor. Because for Russians, it was a very easy way to verify actually where the targets were reached or not. You should not pay, you know, even for the satellite footages. You have people, you know, posting somewhere on their social media footages, what happened, how many people injured, what is going on with the emergency services. So at that point, we were in a position when, as I will tell you, we were not prepared, so to say, as a country, how to react. And then this, so to say, some kind of a partial censorship was introduced in Ukraine, just in order not to play into the hands of the Russian aggressor. So I'm not talking about no big things about like banning Russian media channels, which were made in Ukraine at the beginning of the war, but there is something also like, you know, day to everyday life, like, you know, what is the perfect balance between you are getting people the right to express their opinion and whatever, but you are not, you know, actually revealing, so to say, your plans or the damage or whatever to the Russian aggressor. And you know, we have many practical examples like that. So again, I think this is something about educating society, because when actually some of our ministers were explaining on public why the censorship was introduced on certain video streaming footages and whatever, it was well perceived by the society. So people, some of them who were actually even like making their testimonies, they confessed that they were not aware what kind of damage they're doing. So again, I mean, better education and explaining to the society will mean in the end less censorship of what they are doing, what they are posting, and what they're expressing.
Thank you. My name is Peter from the Technology Industries of Finland. the CEO of cybersecurity industry. And the question actually, what Janne mentioned, I was hoping it to come up, and it luckily did, and the role of companies, the industries, and the economy. Because I think much wiser people than myself have already stated this several times that yes, indeed, militaries can win fights, but the war is won via economies. So hence, I would like to hear a little bit more on what are the key issues. Because in essence, for example, the lessons that we have learned from Finland is that it is actually the companies who do most of it. And I'll say this as a background also, because economy, we know that we have a difference between Finland and Sweden in economy. And we are lucky, I think, because we've had very long time to do this. Otherwise, you wouldn't be asking us to come here and speak. You would only be asking our Swedish colleagues how to do this. So we are lucky in that sense.
What can I say? Sure, the economy, I think, is crucial things in that sense. Because if we are talking about war in a general term, so to say it's very simple, it's about resources and it's about system of administration. So resources, this is about economy. And in our case, also the focus was quite disastrous at the beginning. Because many different plants, factories were either bombarded by Russians or stopped working for example, for the lack of, as was said, for the lack of different resources, and so that perception of collapse was quite clear, and for many people it was even more immediate threat than, for example, the military invasion and Russians coming to your door per se. So what in our case, I think that can be a lesson learned, that companies can play this so to say know-how role in the military spheres if, for example, they were, I don't know, producing bicycles before the war. But no manual of NATO, for example, is containing still the information or the experience of, for example, using drones in this war. And in case of Ukraine, so this 1 million drones produced in 2024 was made actually by hand, so to say, by resources of the small and medium enterprises. So people who were producing civil things before the war, they reoriented fastly their production. So they found the proper staff. So they were able to educate it in a very fast manner. So some of them even, invented, got licenses, and then operational testimony and everything, and then only massive production of the drones in 1 year. I think this is something, incredible in terms of how fast can be the production cycle when you are starting only from the scratch. So I think that you emphasize that the role of economy is there. And do not also forget that for example, that we are spending much more than 3 or 5%. We are spending almost 6% of our GDP on the military sphere. And everything that we are spending on the Ukrainian army is coming from our, so to say, revenues, from our taxes. And this is about economy. So if people can still, can do the business, can still pay the taxes. So this is something which is also, a support for the army.
Preparedness here. Make sure your PC is plugged in. Thank you so much for all your time. I learned a lot. Hopefully, so did the audience. So thank you so much to Krista, to Nataliia, to Janne, and to Maria. We now are very lucky to have a closing keynote speech from Benedetta Berti, who's the Director of NATO Policy Planning in the Office of the Secretary General, to sort of bookend the EU-NATO part of the debate. But please, a round of applause for their panel. Thank you.
That would be wise. Thank you very much. Okay, so good morning, and it is a pleasure to be here, and thanks for the invite. This is, of course, a very, very important and timely discussion on a concept that, as other panelists throughout the day have highlighted, is not new, but I would argue is incredibly relevant and timely in the current strategic environment, one in which we're constantly tested, one in which we essentially have to deal with the issue of how do we preserve peace and security in a complex world where simultaneous threats and challenges both above and below the threshold of armed conflict are essentially the new normal. So how do you defend your security and freedom in an environment that is what we say at NATO, the most contested and complex and unpredictable security environment we have seen since the end of the Cold War. So in that context, I think preparedness becomes really a crucial word. Preparedness of our militaries, preparedness of our societies, preparedness of our democracies to withstand multiple simultaneous attacks. So I'm just going to elaborate a little bit on this concept and why I think that the concept of comprehensive security and looking at other best practices could be really, really useful for what we need to do, for what we are required to do as an alliance. So my starting point is that the security environment really demands it. And NATO, when we agree our last main strategy in 2022, the NATO strategic concepts, that strategy started the analysis by saying the Euro-Atlantic area is not at peace. That element has remained very salient and relevant in our analysis. And the new Secretary General of NATO, Mark Rutte, has reminded us, and I think very pointedly, we're not at war, but we're not at peace. We certainly are not at peace today. And that requires a big strategic mindset shift that we are undertaking collectively as transatlantic allies, as Europeans, but I think we can and should go faster and further. Being not at peace means, first of all, that the Euro-Atlantic area is not at peace because Russia's brutal war of aggression continues. The outcome of the war in Ukraine will continue to be incredibly important for the security of the Euro-Atlantic area and Europe as well. So that's why it's so important for Ukraine to prevail as a sovereign independent country. But it's not just about a full-scale war of aggression being waged in Europe. We're also not at peace because of strategic competition, meaning that potential adversaries and competitors are challenging us, testing our resolve, testing our boundaries, seeking to undermine our security by using essentially all the tools in the toolbox. That's what we call the weaponization of everything. And I think we are seeing case studies upon case studies of what that means, from instrumentalization of migration to energy blackmail, and from systematic destabilization campaigns through sabotage, espionage, disinformation, you name it. It is really across the spectrum, blurring the lines in a way between the peacetime, the conflict, and the crisis. And we need to become much more comfortable, unfortunately, not because of our desire, but that's the world we live in, to defend and protect ourselves in this time of persistent competition, when there are lines between the civil and the military, the kinetic and the non-kinetic, the defense and the security, the military and the non-military are really much more blurred. So that is, in a nutshell, the security environment, the problem set we need to solve. And we don't have to solve it in isolation. In addition to everything I'm saying, in addition to having a full-scale war of aggression, in addition to having constant competition and contestation, we also face crisis in our broader neighborhood and systemic shocks that will continue, whether it's extreme weather-induced events, pandemics, whatever it is. The name of the game remains preparedness, and the name of the game remains how do we shift towards a mindset that is in line with the reality. So a mindset that allows us to be prepared for wartime or being prepared for non-peace. I think there are some elements of what that means that have been discussed throughout the day. So I'm just going to bring them up and say why I think those are real key, and also how NATO EU, in my opinion, can be a really incredibly useful and powerful lever to multiply our respective efforts and get to this whole of society understanding of preparedness and comprehensive security. So first, and this is not surprising, I think if we are talking about how do we prepare collectively and credibly for non-peace, the first the first on our to-do list remains to have a credible military instrument of power. In other words, to continue to invest in our armed forces. This is something for European, especially, has been a very important driving strategic adaptation in the past 10 years. We essentially recover from a post-Cold War peace dividend where we spent too little and produced too little. Since 2014, we have been very deliberately making up for that deficit, but we have gone far, we've gone fast, but we need to go further and faster. And so here, the discussions that you've had today as well about continuing to increase defense spending and continue to strengthen both the European and the transatlantic defense industrial base, those remain, I think, essential to any solid integrated understanding of how do we deal with non-peace. So I start with that because I would be remiss if I didn't start with saying we need strong militaries. Without it, we cannot deal with this contested security environment. However, and that's when your discussion becomes, I think, so relevant, strong militaries needs to depend on strong societies and also on a strong enabling context. And that's very quickly when we go and talk about the resilience aspect of preparedness. And when we talk first and foremost, the importance of making sure that the civilian, mostly civilian infrastructure that is mission critical for defense, we need to ensure that that civilian infrastructure is safe, that is redundant, that is protected from sabotage, that is protected from external attacks, that it's not vulnerable through economic dependencies or other types of dependencies. That's really important because our militaries will need that infrastructure in order to operate, and that is civilian owned. Transportation infrastructure, digital infrastructure, the broader communication infrastructure, civilian satellites, energy grids, energy infrastructure, all of these are essential to having a fully function military and a fully function collective defense. And that's why in NATO, they show resilience of our critical infrastructure as being really a key driver of our policy development in recent years, thinking about national responsibilities, but collective commitment, and how do we really enhance our collective level of resilience over critical infrastructure. We're now moving to having national plans, and those nationally owned plans will really help us to make sure that collectively our broader critical infrastructure is fit for purpose. But of course, when you talk about critical infrastructure being fit for purpose, you go very quickly into the discussion you've had today, which is this cannot be done just by the militaries. This cannot be done just by defense ministries. This has to be done by a whole of society, whole of government approach. And that's very much the rethinking of comprehensive security that we need. This is very clear for issues like 5G, for example. Of course, we need to work with the private sector, commercial operators. All of them have not just they have to be actively involved in active stakeholders. And I think that's really, really key to how we build this whole of society understanding of critical infrastructure. Undersea cable is a recent example that has gathered a lot of attention, and rightfully so, of course, because increasing recent incidents, including in the Baltic Sea, but also because we understand that this is a very good case study as why critical infrastructure is mission critical for the militaries, but also essential for our prosperity and economies and security. Because of course, this undersea infrastructure, whether it's about energy or about digital communication, they're really very much part and parcel of of our collective prosperity, right? So the recent examples and the recent incidents have, if anything, heightened the importance of protecting and ensuring them. And just today, my boss, Mark Rutte, is meeting with the leaders from the Baltic countries in Helsinki, essentially taking, not just discussing, but also taking practical decisions to strengthen what we do together as an alliance and with allies to ensure that we have greater vigilance, that we're able to increase our situational awareness so we can better monitor potential threats to undersea cables. And that's a role NATO has also played recently, including when increasing its patrolling and exercising in the in the Baltic Sea. But we are going to do more. I'm not not going to steal the thunder from my boss, so you will announce it today. In addition, NATO, through the Maritime Command, MARCOM, and our Center for Critical Undersea Infrastructure, and our additional unit in the headquarters, is looking at how to increase situational awareness, but also how to coordinate better. Again, it's a show and tell of what whole of society means. It's working with industry, working with different parts of government, working with our counterparts in the European Union, because of course we all have different tools and different added value to bring to this challenge. Very briefly, not to go too long, because you already have a very, very full day of discussion, but I would say these are all key elements of how you build a whole of society, a comprehensive mindset that is fit for non-peace. It is strengthening our militaries. It is about building the resilience of our critical infrastructure. It is about creating a inclusive culture of risk management that includes the private sector, that empowers citizens, that really operationalizes this whole of government concept. And then, of course, from my perspective, it's also about taking a close look at society. And that's really what some of the best practices that were discussed today, whether it's about Ukraine, whether it's about our Baltic Nordic allies, they really show what that means in practice. I think different countries in the transatlantic community will have either a lot or a little to relearn when it comes to building a culture of defense, when it comes to involving and educated citizens. Again, as you said throughout the morning, not to scare, but to prepare. And essentially preparedness is a way through which we actually limit sense of insecurity by empowering citizens to have an active role in their defense, security, and protection of their freedom. So I think that's very, very important. And you highlighted some of the best practices that have to do with education, have to do with really early involvement, have to do with a whole of society understanding of emergency planning. A lot of this is being rethought, redone, rebuilt after decades in which essentially we had what we thought was a more benign security environment. So there's a lot of catching up to do, but I'm very optimistic given that we are all really seeing the same threat picture and adapting accordingly. So I think those elements taken together really exemplify what a mindset shift, what a preparing for a mindset of non-peace or conflict or wartime mindset means. Strong military resilient society, broad understanding of security that spans from the kinetic to the non-kinetic, and understands how to mitigate economic vulnerabilities, as well as how to take into account more traditional defense issues. All of it together it's what we're doing, it's how we're adapting, and I think it's really the right way to go. In the last 30 seconds, NATO-EU cooperation has been and will continue to be one of the key ways through which we advance in this thinking. And we're doing it, whether it's on the cooperation we've had on issues related to critical infrastructure with the NATO-EU task force on critical infrastructure as part of our structured dialogue on resilience. We're doing it by restarting this high-level task force on NATO-EU cooperation, again, to take some of these elements and flesh out operationally, how do we go to the next chapter. And all of that is, I would say, also very much in line with the minister report that we've all read on both sides of town, and that gives us, I think, plenty of inspiration in terms of the practical call to action items that we should pursue together. So I think that's, in a nutshell, the homework. The bad news is that there's a lot of homework. The good news is, I think, we have greater strategic clarity on our objectives and what we need to do that we've had for decades. So I think that's actually something very positive brought about by what is the most complex and dangerous security environment in generations. But despite of that, I think that strategic clarity gives me cause for hope. And I'll close here. Thank you.
Thank you, Benedetta, and thank you to all the speakers who have taken their time to be here today with us to share their best practice examples and experiences. In particular, I would like to thank, I've just mentioned, Office of the Secretary General in Benedetta, the Cabinet of Executive Vice President Virkkunen, as well as Ukraine's mission to NATO, the Financial Times, which has fantastic moderation of an excellent panel, and distinguished guests who have come all the way from Estonia, Finland, and Sweden. I would also like to thank the audience. This is your third hour in this event, the audience in the room but online as well. Your participation not only shows your priorities and your interest in the topic, it shows that you care. You care about the state of European and Euro-Atlantic security. You care about your institution, perhaps that's NATO, perhaps it's the EU, perhaps it's a newspaper or your household. And you care about the role that you can play in helping Europe and Euro-Atlantic institutions and at national level in this very critical moment for Europe. Because when we care, we act. And action is at the heart of preparedness, at the whole of government and whole of society approach. So thank you. We heard a lot from the national, at the national level, at EU, at the NATO level. And it has become very clear that so much already has been done, you know, in terms of EU, the civil protection mechanism, now in Nistro's report at NATO level, resilience, and what Benedetta very elegantly called creating this enabling environment across the military and societal spheres. But a lot still needs to be done. And here, just to mention a few things that really stuck out, sharing situational awareness, having a EU-NATO emergency protocol development, joint exercises, equipping critical infrastructure with new technologies, but also talking and appealing to our societies so that the messages are understood, not just in terms of terminology, what is preparedness, but how does it work? What do I learn? What role can I play? Where do I stand in this process? And the Ukrainian ambassador highlighted very strongly the need to increase defense spending and the need to ramp up defense production with the whole of Europe and whole of society at large. And may I just point that NATO's defense spending is primarily military, which is critical for armed forces, for equipment, for capabilities, but we need to also talk about civilian defense spending. It has to be civil military defense expenditure. It's important. I would like you all to leave this room, or whoever is in the online audience, by asking yourselves here in Brussels, are you prepared? Are you prepared for an emergency or crisis, perhaps war? What can you bring to the table? And demand it from your leaders, demand that information. You have a right to know. Comprehensive security preparedness is not a privilege. It's a civil and military necessity. And it is everyone's right to know how to survive and prepare for any crisis and war. Looking ahead, keep an eye on EPC's agendas, that of Bank of Ideas and Hanaholmen, because we will try to keep this important priority on the political agenda. And thank you very much once again for taking your time, to the speakers and to the audience alike, for sharing this important priority with us. Thank you.